The Golden Goose. There was once a man who had 3 sons. The youngest was called Dummerly, and was on all occasions scorned and ill-treated by the whole family. It happened that the eldest took it into his head one day to go into the forest to cut wood, and his mother gave him a delicious meat pie and a bottle of wine to take with him, that he might sustain himself at his work. As he went into the forest, a little old man bid him good day, and said, "Give me a little bit of meat from your plate, and a little wine out of your flask. I am very hungry and thirsty." But this clever young man said, "Give you my meat and wine? No, I thank you, there would not be enough left for me." And he went on his way. He soon began to chop down a tree, but he had not worked long before he missed his stroke, and cut himself, and was obliged to go home and have the wound bound up. Now, it was the little old man who caused him this mischief. Next the second son went out to work, and his mother gave him, too, a meat pie and a bottle of wine. And the same little old man encountered him also, and begged him for something to eat and drink. But he, too, thought himself extremely clever, and said, "Whatever you get, I shall be without, so go your way." The little man made sure that he should have his reward, and the second stroke that he struck at a tree hit him on the leg, so that he too was compelled to go home. Then Dummerly said, "Father, I should like to go and cut fuel too." But his father replied, "Your brothers have both maimed themselves. You had better stop at home, for you know nothing of the job." But Dummerly was very urgent, and at last his father said, "Go your way, you will be wiser when you have suffered for your foolishness." And his mother gave him only some dry bread, and a bottle of sour ale. But when he went into the forest, he met the little old man, who said, "Give me some meat and drink, for I am very hungry and thirsty." Dummerly said, "I have nothing but dry bread and sour beer. If that will do for you, we will sit down and eat it together." So they sat down, and when the lad took out his bread, behold, it was turned into a splendid meat pie, and his sour beer became delicious wine. They ate and drank heartily, and when they had finished, the little man said, "As you have a kind heart, and have been willing to share everything with me, I will bring good to you. There stands an old tree. Chop it down, and you will find something at the root." Then he took his leave and went his way. Dummerly set to work, and cut down the tree, and when it fell, he discovered in a hollow under the roots a goose with plumage of pure gold. He took it up, and went on to an inn, where he proposed sleep for the night. The landlord had 3 daughters, and when they saw the goose, they were very curious to find out what this wonderful bird could be, and wished very much to pluck one of the feathers out of its tail. At last the eldest said, "I must and will have a feather." So she waited till his back was turned, and then caught hold of the goose by the wing. But to her great surprise, there she stuck, for neither hand nor finger could she pull away again. Presently in came the second sister, and thought to have a feather too, but the instant she touched her sister, there she too hung fast. At last came the third, and desired a feather, but the other 2 cried out, "Keep away! For heaven's sake, keep away!" However, she did not understand what they meant. "If they are there," thought she, "I may as well be there too," so she went up to them. But the moment she touched her sisters she stuck fast, and hung to the goose as they did. And so they abode with the goose all night. The next morning Dummerly carried off the goose under his arm, and took no heed of the 3 girls, but went out with them sticking fast behind, and wherever he journeyed, the 3 were obliged to follow, whether they wished or not, as fast as their legs could carry them. In the middle of a field the parson met them, and when he saw the procession, he said, "Are you not ashamed of yourselves, you bold girls, to run after the young man like that over the fields? Is that proper behavior?" Then he took the youngest by the hand to lead her away, but the moment he touched her he, too, hung fast, and followed in the procession. Presently up came the clerk, and when he saw his master, the parson, running after the 3 girls, he was greatly surprised, and said, "Hollo! Hollo!
Your reverence."
Whither so fast? There is a christening today." Then he ran up, and caught him by the gown, and instantly he was fast too. As the 5 were thus trudging along, one after another, they met 2 laborers with their mattocks coming from work, and the parson called out to them to set him free. But hardly had they touched him, when they, too, joined the ranks, and so made 7, all running after Dummerly and his goose. At last they came to a city, where reigned a king who had an only daughter. The princess was of so thoughtful and serious a turn of mind that no one could make her laugh, and the king had announced to all the world that whoever could make her laugh should have her for his wife. When the young man heard this, he went to her with the goose and all its followers, and as soon as she saw the 7 all hanging together, and running about, treading on each other's heels, she could not help bursting into a long and loud laugh. Then Dummerly claimed her for his bride. The wedding took place, and he was heir to the kingdom, and lived long and happily with his wife.
Bearskin. There was once upon a time a young fellow who enlisted for a soldier, and became so brave and courageous that he was always in the front ranks when it rained blue beans. As long as the war lasted all went well, but when peace was concluded he received his discharge, and the captain told him he might go where he liked. His parents meanwhile had died, and as he had no longer any home to go to he paid a visit to his brothers, and asked them to give him shelter until war broke out again. His brothers, however, were hard-hearted, and said, "What could we do with you? We could make nothing of you, see to what you have brought yourself," and so turned a deaf ear. The poor soldier had nothing but his musket left, so he mounted this on his shoulder and set out on a tramp. By and by he came to a great heath with nothing on it but a circle of trees, under which he sat down, sorrowfully considering his fate. "I have no money," thought he, "I have learnt nothing but soldiering, and now, since peace is concluded, there is no need of me. I see well enough I shall have to starve." All at once he heard a rustling, and as he looked round he perceived a stranger standing before him, dressed in a grey coat, who looked very stately, but had an ugly cloven foot. "I know quite well what you need," said this being. "Gold and other possessions you shall have, as much as you can spend, but first I must know whether you are a coward or not, that I may not spend my money foolishly." "A soldier and a coward," replied the other, "that cannot be, you may put me to any proof." "Well, then," replied the stranger, "look behind you." The soldier turned and saw a huge bear, which eyed him very ferociously. "Aho," cried he, "I will tickle your nose for you, that you shall no longer be able to grumble," and, raising his musket, he shot the bear in the forehead, so that he tumbled in a heap upon the ground, and did not stir afterward. Thereupon the stranger said, "I see quite well that you are not wanting in courage, but there is yet one condition which you must fulfill." "If it does not interfere with my future happiness," said the soldier, who had remarked who it was that addressed him, "if it does not interfere with that, I shall not hesitate." "That you must see about yourself," said the stranger. "For the next 7 years you must not wash yourself, nor comb your hair or beard, neither must you cut your nails nor say one paternoster. Then I will give you this coat and mantle, which you must wear during these 7 years, and if you die within that time you are mine, but if you live you are rich and free all your life long." The soldier reflected for a while on his great necessities, and, remembering how often he had braved death, he at length consented, and ventured to accept the offer. Thereupon the evil one pulled off the grey coat, handed it to the soldier, and said, "If you at any time search in the pockets of your coat when you have it on, you will always find your hand full of money." Then also he pulled off the skin of the bear, and said, "That shall be your cloak and your bed, you must sleep on it, and not dare to lie in any other bed, and on this account you shall be called Bearskin." Immediately the evil one disappeared. The soldier now put on the coat, and dipped his hands into the pockets, to assure himself of the reality of the transaction. Then he hung the bearskin around himself, and went about the world chuckling at his good luck, and buying whatever suited his fancy which money could purchase. For the first year his appearance was not very remarkable, but in the second he began to look quite a monster. His hair covered almost all his face, his beard appeared like a piece of dirty cloth, his nails were claws, and his countenance was so covered with dirt that one might have grown cresses upon it if one had sown seed. Whoever looked at him ran away, but because he gave the poor in every place gold coin they prayed that he might not die during the 7 years, and because he paid liberally everywhere, he found a night's lodging without difficulty. In the 4th year he came to an inn where the landlord would not take him in, and refused even to give him a place in his stables, lest the horses should be frightened and become restive. However, when Bearskin put his hand into his pocket and drew it out full of gold ducats, the landlord yielded the point, and gave him a place in the outbuildings, but not till he had promised that he would not show himself, for fear the inn should gain a bad name. While Bearskin sat by himself in the evening, wishing from his heart that the 7 years were over, he heard in the corner a loud groan. Now the old soldier had a compassionate heart, so he opened the door and saw an old man weeping violently and wringing his hands. Bearskin stepped nearer, but the old man jumped up and tried to escape, But when he recognized a human voice he let himself be persuaded, and by kind words and soothings on the part of the old soldier he at length disclosed the cause of his distress. His property had dwindled away by degrees, and he and his daughters would have to starve, for he was so poor that he had not the money to pay the host, and would therefore be put into prison. "If you have no care except that," replied Bearskin, "I have money enough," and causing the landlord to be called, he paid him, and put a purse full of gold besides into the pocket of the old man. The latter, when he saw himself released from his troubles, knew not how to be sufficiently grateful, and said to the soldier, "Come with me. My daughters are all wonders of beauty, so choose one of them for a wife. When they hear what you have done for me they will not refuse you. You appear certainly an uncommon man, but they will soon put you to rights." This speech pleased Bearskin, and he went with the old man. As soon as the eldest daughter saw him, she was so terrified at his countenance that she shrieked out and ran away. The second one stopped and looked at him from head to foot, but at last she said, "How can I take a husband who has not a bit of a human countenance? The grizzly bear would have pleased me better, who came to see us once, and gave himself out as a man, for he wore a hussar's hat, and had white gloves on besides." But the youngest daughter said, "Dear father, this must be a good man who has assisted you out of your troubles. If you have promised him a bride for the service your word must be kept." It was a pity the man's face was covered with dirt and hair, else one would have seen how glad at heart these words made him. Bearskin took a ring off his finger, broke it in two, and, giving the youngest daughter one half, he kept the other for himself. On her half he wrote his name, and on his own he wrote hers, and begged her to preserve it carefully. Thereupon he took leave, saying, "For 3 years longer I must wander about. If I come back again, then we will celebrate our wedding, but if I do not, you are free, for I shall be dead. But pray to God that he will preserve my life." When he was gone the poor bride clothed herself in black, and whenever she thought of her bridegroom burst into tears. From her sisters she received nothing but scorn and mocking. "Pay great attention when he shakes your hand," said the eldest, "and you will see his beautiful claws. Take care," said the second, "bears are fond of sweets, and if you please him he will eat you up, perhaps. You must mind and do his will," continued the eldest, "or he will begin growling." And the second daughter said further, "But the wedding will certainly be merry, for bears dance well." The bride kept silence, and would not be drawn from her purpose by all these taunts, and meanwhile Bearskin wandered about in the world, doing good where he could, and giving liberally to the poor, for which they prayed heartily for him. At length the last day of the 7 years approached, and Bearskin went and sat down again on the heath beneath the circle of trees. In a very short time the wind whistled, and the evil one presently stood before him and looked at him with a vexed face. He threw the soldier his old coat and demanded his grey one back. "We have not got so far as that yet," replied Bearskin. "You must clean me first." Then the evil one had, whether he liked it or no, to fetch water, wash the old soldier, comb his hair out, and cut his nails. This done, he appeared again like a brave warrior, and indeed was much handsomer than before. As soon as the evil one had disappeared, Bearskin became quite light-hearted, and going into the nearest town he bought a fine velvet coat, and hired a carriage drawn by 4 white horses, in which he was driven to the house of his bride. Nobody knew him. The father took him for some celebrated general, and led him into the room where his daughters were. He was compelled to sit down between the 2 eldest, and they offered him wine, and heaped his plate with the choicest morsels, for they thought they had never seen anyone so handsome before. But the bride sat opposite to him dressed in black, neither opening her eyes nor speaking a word. At length the soldier asked the father if he would give him one of his daughters to wife, and immediately the 2 elder sisters arose, and ran to their chambers to dress themselves out in their most becoming clothes, for each thought she should be chosen. Meanwhile the stranger, as soon as he found himself alone with his bride, pulled out the half of the ring and threw it into a cup of wine, which he handed across the table. She took it, and as soon as she had drunk it and seen the half-ring lying at the bottom her heart beat rapidly, and she produced the other half, which she wore round her neck on a riband. She held them together, and they joined each other exactly, and the stranger said, "I am your bridegroom, whom you first saw as Bearskin, but through God's mercy I have regained my human form, and am myself once more." With these words he embraced and kissed her, and at the same time the 2 eldest sisters entered in full costume. As soon as they saw that the very handsome man had fallen to the share of their youngest sister, and heard that he was the same as Bearskin, They ran out of the house full of rage and jealousy.
Faithful John. Once upon a time there lived an old king, who fell very sick, and thought he was lying upon his deathbed. So he said, "Let faithful John come to me." This faithful John was his affectionate servant, and was so called because he had been true to him all his lifetime. As soon as John came to the bedside, the king said, "My faithful John, I feel that my end approaches, and I have no other care than about my son, who is still so young that he cannot always guide himself aright. If you do not promise to instruct him in everything he ought to know, and to be his guardian, I cannot close my eyes in peace." Then John answered, "I will never leave him. I will always serve him truly, even if it costs me my life." So the old king was comforted and said, "Now I can die in peace. After my death you must show him all the chambers, halls, and vaults in the castle, and all the treasures which are in them. But the last room in the long corridor you must not show him, for in it hangs the portrait of the daughter of the king of the Golden Palace. If he sees her picture, he will conceive a great love for her, and will fall down in a swoon, and on her account undergo great perils, therefore you must keep him away." The faithful John pressed his master's hand again in token of assent, and soon after the king laid his head upon the pillow and expired. After the old king had been borne to his grave, the faithful John related to the young king all that his father had said upon his deathbed, and declared, "All this I will certainly fulfill. I will be as true to you as I was to him, if it costs me my life." When the time of mourning was past, John said to the young king, "It is now time for you to see your inheritance. I will show you your paternal castle." So he led the king all over it, upstairs and downstairs, and showed him all the riches, and all the splendid chambers. Only one room he did not open, containing the perilous portrait, which was so placed that one saw it directly the door was opened, and, moreover, it was so beautifully painted that one thought it breathed and moved. Nothing in all the world could be more lifelike or more beautiful. The young king remarked, however, that the faithful John always passed by one door, so he asked, "Why do you not open that one?" "There is something in it," he replied, "which will frighten you." But the king said, "I have seen all the rest of the castle, and I will know what is in there," and he went and tried to open the door by force. The faithful John pulled him back and said, "I promised your father before he died that you should not see the contents of that room. It would bring great misfortunes both upon you and me." "Oh no," replied the young king. "If I do not go in it will be my certain ruin. I should have no peace night nor day until I had seen it with my own eyes. Now I will not stir from the place till you unlock the door." Then the faithful John saw that it was of no use talking. So, with a heavy heart and many sighs, he picked the key out of the great bunch. When he had opened the door, he went in first, and thought he would cover up the picture, that the king should not see it. But it was of no use, for the king stepped upon tiptoes and looked over his shoulder, and as soon as he saw the portrait of the maiden, which was so beautiful and glittered with precious stones, he fell down on the ground insensible. The faithful John lifted him up and carried him to his bed, and thought with great concern, "Mercy on us! The misfortune has happened. What will come of it?" And he gave the young king wine until he came to himself. The first words he spoke were, "Who does that beautiful picture represent?" "That is the daughter of the king of the Golden Palace," was the reply. "Then," said the king, "my love for her is so great that if all the leaves on the trees had tongues, they should not gainsay it. My life is set upon the search for her. You are my faithful John. You must accompany me." The trusty servant deliberated for a long while how to set about this business, for it was very difficult to get into the presence of the king's daughter. At last he bethought himself of a way, and said to the king, "Everything which she has around her is of gold: chairs, tables, dishes, bowls, and all the household utensils. Among your treasures are 5 tons of gold. Let one of the goldsmiths of your kingdom manufacture vessels and utensils of all kinds therefrom, all kinds of birds, and wild and wonderful beasts, such as will please her. Then we will travel with these, and try our luck." Then the king summoned all his goldsmiths, who worked day and night until many very beautiful things were ready. When all had been placed on board a ship, the faithful John put on merchant's clothes, and the king likewise, so that they might travel quite unknown. Then they sailed over the wide sea, and sailed away until they came to the city where dwelt the daughter of the king of the Golden Palace. The faithful John told the king to remain in the ship, and wait for him. "Perhaps," said he, "I shall bring the king's daughter with me. Therefore take care that all is in order, and set out the golden vessels and adorn the whole ship." Thereupon John placed in a napkin some of the golden cups, stepped upon land, and went straight to the king's palace. When he came into the castle yard, a beautiful maid stood by the brook, who had 2 golden pails in her hand, drawing water, and when she had filled them and had turned round, she saw a strange man, and asked who he was. Then John answered, "I am a merchant," and opening his napkin he showed her its contents. Then she exclaimed, "Oh, what beautiful golden things!" And setting the pails down, she looked at the cups one after another, and said, "The king's daughter must see these. She is so pleased with anything made of gold that she will buy all these." And taking him by the hand, she led him in, for she was the lady's maid. When the king's daughter saw the golden cups, she was much pleased, and said, "They are so finely worked that I will purchase them all." But the faithful John replied, "I am only the servant of a rich merchant. What I have here is nothing in comparison to those which my master has in his ship, than which nothing more delicate or costly has ever been worked in gold." Then the king's daughter wished to have them all brought, but he said, "It would take many days, and so great is the quantity that your palace has not halls enough in it to place them around." Then her curiosity and desire were still more excited, and at last she said, "Take me to the ship. I will go myself and look at your master's treasure." The faithful John conducted her to the ship with great joy, and the king, when he beheld her, saw that her beauty was still greater than the picture had represented, and thought nothing else but that his heart would jump out of his mouth. Presently she stepped on board, and the king conducted her below, but the faithful John remained on deck by the steersman, and told him to unmoor the ship and put on all the sail he could, that it might fly as a bird through the air. Meanwhile the king showed the princess all the golden treasures, the dishes, cups, bowls, the birds, the wild and wonderful beasts. Many hours passed away while she looked at everything, and in her joy she did not remark that the ship sailed on and on. As soon as she had looked at the last, and thanked the merchant, she wished to depart. But when she came on deck, she perceived that they were upon the high sea, far from the shore, and were hastening on with all sail. "Ah!" she exclaimed in affright, "I am betrayed. I am carried off and taken away in the power of a strange merchant. I would rather die." But the king, taking her by the hand, said, "I am not a merchant, but a king, thine equal in birth. It is true that I have carried thee off, but that is because of my overwhelming love for thee. Dost thou know that when I first saw the portrait of thy beauteous face, I fell down in a swoon before it?" When the king's daughter heard these words, she was reassured, and her heart was inclined toward him, so that she willingly became his bride. While they thus went on their voyage on the high sea, it happened that the faithful John, as he sat on the deck of the ship, playing music, saw 3 crows in the air, who came flying toward them. He stopped playing, and listened to what they were saying to each other, for he understood them perfectly. The first one exclaimed, "There he is, carrying home the daughter of the king of the golden palace." "But he is not home yet," replied the second. "But he has her," said the third. "She is sitting by him in the ship." Then the first began again, and exclaimed, "What matters that? When they go on shore, a fox-colored horse will spring toward them, on which he will mount, and as soon as he is on it, it will jump up with him into the air, so that he will never again see his bride." The second one asked, "Is there no escape?" "Oh, yes, if another mounts behind quickly, and takes out the firearms which are in the holster, and with them shoots the horse dead, then the young king will be saved. But who knows that? And if anyone does know it, and tells him, such a one will be turned to stone from the toe to the knee." Then the second spoke again, "I know still more. If the horse should be killed, the young king will not then retain his bride, for when they come into the castle a beautiful bridal shirt will lie there upon a dish, and seem to be woven of gold and silver, but it is nothing but sulfur and pitch, and if he puts it on it will burn him to his marrow and bones." Then the third crow asked, "Is there no escape?" "Oh, yes," answered the second. "If someone takes up the shirt with his glove on, and throws it into the fire, so that it is burnt, the young king will be saved. But what does that signify? Whoever knows it, and tells him, will be turned to stone from his knee to his heart." Then the third crow spoke, "I know still more. Even if the bridal shirt be consumed, still the young king will not retain his bride. For if, after the wedding, a dance is held, while the young queen dances she will suddenly turn pale, and fall down as if dead, and if someone does not raise her up, and take 3 drops of blood from her right breast and throw them away, she will die. But whoever knows that, and tells it, will have his whole body turned to stone, from the crown of his head to the toes of his feet." After the crows had thus talked with one another, they flew away, and the trusty John, who had perfectly understood all they had said, was from that time very quiet and sad. For if he concealed from his master what he had heard, misfortune would happen to him, and if he told him all he must give up his own life. But at last he thought, I will save my master, even if I destroy myself. As soon as they came on shore, it happened just as the crow had foretold, and an immense fox-red horse sprang up. Capital, said the king, this shall carry me to my castle. And he tried to mount, but the faithful John came straight up, and swinging himself quickly on, drew the firearms out of the holster and shot the horse dead. Then the other servants of the king, who were not on good terms with the faithful John, exclaimed, How shameful to kill the beautiful creature, which might have borne the king to the castle. But the king replied, Be silent, and let him go. He is my very faithful John. Who knows the good he may have done? Now they went into the castle, and there stood a dish in the hall, and the splendid bridal shirt lay in it, and seemed nothing else than gold and silver. The young king went up to it and wished to take it up, but the faithful John pushed him away, and taking it up with his gloves on, bore it quickly to the fire and let it burn. The other servants thereupon began to murmur, saying, See, now he is burning the king's bridal shirt. But the young king replied, Who knows what good he has done? Let him alone. He is my faithful John. Soon after, the wedding was celebrated, and a grand ball was given, and the bride began to dance. So the faithful John paid great attention, and watched her countenance. All at once she grew pale, and fell as if dead to the ground. Then he sprang up hastily, raised her up and bore her to a chamber, where he laid her down, kneeled beside her, and drawing the 3 drops of blood out of her right breast, threw them away. As soon as she breathed again, she raised herself up. But the young king had witnessed everything, and not knowing why the faithful John had done this was very angry, and called out, Throw him into prison! The next morning the trusty John was brought up for trial, and led to the gallows. And as he stood upon them, and was about to be executed, he said, Every one condemned to die may once before his death speak. Shall I also have that privilege? Yes, answered the king. It shall be granted you. Then the faithful John replied, I have been unrighteously judged, and have always been true to you. And he narrated the conversation of the crows which he heard at sea, and how, in order to save his master, he was obliged to do all he had done. Then the king cried out, Oh, my most trusty John, pardon, pardon, lead him away. But the trusty John had fallen down at the last word, and was turned into stone. At this event both the king and the queen were in great grief, and the king thought, Ah, how wickedly have I rewarded his great fidelity! And he had the stone statue raised up and placed in his sleeping chamber, near his bed, and as often as he looked at it, he wept and said, Ah, could I bring you back to life again, my faithful John! After some time had passed, the queen bore twins, 2 little sons, who were her great joy. Once, when the queen was in church, and the 2 children at home playing by their father's side, he looked up at the stone statue full of sorrow, and exclaimed with a sigh, Ah, could I restore you to life, my faithful John! At these words the statue began to speak, saying, Yes, you can make me alive again, if you will bestow on me that which is dearest to you. The king replied, All that I have in the world I will give up for you. The statue spake again, If you, with your own hand, cut off the heads of both your children, and sprinkle me with their blood, I shall be brought to life again. The king was terrified when he heard that he must himself kill his 2 dear children. But he remembered his servant's great fidelity, and how the faithful John had died for him, and drawing his sword he cut off the heads of both his children with his own hand. And as soon as he had sprinkled the statue with blood, life came back to it, and the trusty John stood again alive and well before him, and said, Your faith shall not go unrewarded. And taking the heads of the 2 children he set them on again, and anointed their wounds with their blood, and thereupon they healed again in a moment, and the children sprang away and played as if nothing had happened. Now the king was full of happiness, and as soon as he saw the queen coming, he hid the faithful John and both the children in a great closet. As soon as she came in he said to her, Have you prayed in the church? Yes, she answered. But I thought continually of the faithful John, who has come to such misfortune through us. Then he replied, My dear wife, we can restore his life again to him, but it will cost us both our little sons, whom we must sacrifice. The queen became pale and was terrified at heart, but she said, We are guilty of his life on account of his great fidelity. Then he was very glad that she thought as he did, and going up to the closet, he unlocked it, brought out the children and the faithful John, saying, God be praised. He is saved, and we have still our little sons." And then he told her all that happened. Afterward they lived happily together to the end of their days.
The water of life. Once upon a time there was a king who was so ill that everybody despaired of his life, and his 3 sons were very sorry, and went out into the palace gardens to weep. There they met an old man, who asked the cause of their grief, and they told him their father was so ill that he must die, for nothing could save him. The old man said, "I know a means of saving him. If he drinks of the water of life it will restore him to health, but it is very difficult to find." "I will soon find it," said the eldest son, and, going to the sick king, he begged his permission to set out in search of the water of life, which alone could save him. "No, the danger is too great," said the king. "I prefer to die." Nevertheless, the son begged and entreated so long that the king consented, and the prince went away, thinking in his own heart, "If I bring this water I am the dearest to my father, and I shall inherit his kingdom." After he had ridden a long way he met a dwarf on the road, who asked him, "Whither away so quickly?" "You stupid dandiprat," replied the prince proudly, "why should I tell you that?" And he rode off. But the little man was angry and he wished an evil thing, so that, soon after, the prince came into a narrow mountain pass, and the farther he rode the narrower it grew, till at last it was so close that he could get no farther, but neither could he turn his horse round, nor dismount, and he sat there like one amazed. Meanwhile the sick king waited a long while for him, but he did not come, and the second son asked leave to go too and seek the water, for he thought to himself, "If my brother is dead the kingdom comes to me." At first the king refused to spare him, but he gave way, and the prince set out on the same road as the elder one had taken, and met also the same dwarf, who stopped him and asked him, "Whither ride you so hastily?" "Little dandiprat," replied the prince, "what do you want to know for?" And he rode off without looking round. The dwarf, however, enchanted him, and it happened to him as it had to his brother. He came to a defile where he could move neither forward nor backward. Such is the fate of all haughty people. Now, when the second son did not return, the youngest begged leave to go and fetch the water, and the king was obliged at last to give his consent. When he met the dwarf, and was asked whither he was going so hurriedly, he stopped and replied, "I seek the water of life, for my father is sick unto death." "Do you know where to find it?" asked the dwarf. "No," replied the prince. "Since you have behaved yourself as you ought," said the dwarf, "and not haughtily like your false brothers, I will give you information and show you where you may obtain the water of life. It flows from a fountain in the court of an enchanted castle, into which you can never penetrate if I do not give you an iron rod and 2 loaves of bread. With the rod knock thrice at the iron door of the castle, and it will spring open. Within lie 2 lions with open jaws, but if you throw down to each a loaf of bread they will be quiet. Then hasten and fetch some of the water of life before it strikes 12, for then the door will shut again, and you will be imprisoned." The prince thanked the dwarf, and, taking the rod and bread, he set out on his journey, and as he arrived at the castle he found it as the dwarf had said. At the 3rd knock the door sprang open, and, when he had stilled the lions with the bread, he walked into a fine, large hall, where sat several enchanted princes, from whose fingers he drew off the rings, and he also took away with him a sword and some bread which lay there. A little farther on he came to a room wherein stood a beautiful maiden, who was so pleased to see him that she kissed him and said he had freed her, and should have her whole kingdom, and if he came in another year their wedding should be celebrated. Then she told him where the fountain of water of life was placed, and he hastened away lest it should strike 12 ere he gained it. He came next into a room where a fine, clean-covered bed stood, and, being tired, he lay down to rest himself a bit. But he went to sleep, and when he awoke it struck the 1:45, and the sound made him hurry to the fountain, from which he took some water in a cup which stood near. This done, he hastened to the door, and was scarcely out before it struck 12, and the door swung to so heavily that it carried away a piece of his heel. But he was very glad, in spite of this, that he had procured the water, and he journeyed homeward, and passed again where the dwarf stood. When the dwarf saw the sword and bread which he had brought away he declared he had done well, for with the sword he could destroy whole armies, but the bread was worth nothing. Now, the prince was not willing to return home to his father without his brothers, and so he said to the dwarf, "Dear dwarf, can you tell me where my brothers are? They went out before me in search of the water of life, and did not return." "They are stuck fast between 2 mountains," replied the dwarf. "Because they were so haughty, I enchanted them there." Then the prince begged for their release, till at last the dwarf brought them out, but he warned the youngest to beware of them, for they had evil in their hearts. When his brothers came he was very glad, and he related to them all that had happened to him, how he had found the water of life and brought away a cupful of it, and how he had rescued a beautiful princess, who for a whole year was going to wait for him, and then he was to return to be married to her, and receive a rich kingdom. After this tale the three brothers rode away together, and soon entered a province where there were war and famine raging, and the king thought he should perish, so great was his necessity. The youngest prince went to this king and gave him the bread, with which he fed and satisfied his whole people, and then the prince gave him the sword, wherewith he defeated and slew all his enemies, and regained peace and quiet. This effected, the prince took back the bread and sword, and rode on farther with his brothers, and by they came to two other provinces where also war and famine were destroying the people. To each king the prince lent his bread and sword, and so saved 3 kingdoms. After this they went on board a ship to pass over the sea which separated them from home, and during the voyage the 2 elder brothers said to one another, "Our brother has found the water of life and we have not, therefore our father will give the kingdom which belongs to us to him, and our fortune will be taken away." Indulging these thoughts they became so envious that they consulted together how they should kill him, and one day, waiting till he was fast asleep, they poured the water out of his cup and took it for themselves, while they filled his up with bitter salt water. As soon as they arrived at home the youngest brother took his cup to the sick king, that he might drink out of it and regain his health. But scarcely had he drunk a very little of the water when he became worse than before, for it was as bitter as wormwood. While the king lay in this state, the 2 elder princes came, and accused their brother of poisoning their father, but they had brought the right water, and they handed it to the king. Scarcely had he drunk a little out of the cup when the king felt his sickness leave him, and soon he was as strong and healthy as in his young days. The 2 brothers now went to the youngest prince, mocking him, and saying, "You certainly found the water of life, but you had the trouble and we had the reward. You should have been more cautious and kept your eyes open, for we took your cup while you were asleep on the sea, and, moreover, in a year one of us intends to fetch your princess. Beware, however, that you betray us not. The king will not believe you, and if you say a single word your life will be lost, but if you remain silent you are safe." The old king, nevertheless, was very angry with his youngest son, who had conspired, as he believed, against his life. He caused his court to be assembled, and sentence was given to the effect that the prince should be secretly shot, and once as he rode out hunting, unsuspicious of any evil, the huntsman was sent with him to perform the deed. By and by, when they were alone in the wood, the huntsman seemed so sad that the prince asked him what ailed him. The huntsman replied, "I cannot and yet must tell you." "Tell me boldly what it is," said the prince, "I will forgive you." "Ah, it is no other than that I must shoot you, for so has the king ordered me," said the huntsman, with a deep sigh. The prince was frightened, and said, "Let me live, dear huntsman, let me live. I will give you my royal coat and you shall give me yours in exchange." To this the huntsman readily assented, for he felt unable to shoot the prince, and after they had exchanged their clothing the huntsman returned home, and the prince went deeper into the wood. A short time afterward 3 wagons laden with gold and precious stones came to the king's palace for his youngest son. They were sent by the 3 kings in token of gratitude for the sword which had defeated their enemies, and the bread which had nourished their people. At this arrival the old king said to himself, "Perhaps, after all, my son was guiltless," and he lamented to his courtiers that he had let his son be killed. But the huntsman cried out, "He lives yet. For I could not find it in my heart to fulfill your commands," and he told the king how it had happened. The king felt as if a stone had been removed from his heart, and he caused it to be proclaimed everywhere throughout his dominions that his son might return and would again be taken into favor. Meanwhile the princess had caused a road to be made up to her castle of pure shining gold, and she told her attendants that whoever should ride straight up this road would be the right person, and one whom they might admit into the castle. But, on the contrary, whoever should ride up not on the road, but by the side, they were ordered on no account to admit, for he was not the right person. When, therefore, the time came round which the princess had mentioned to the youngest prince, the eldest brother thought he would hasten to her castle and announce himself as her deliverer, that he might gain her as a bride and the kingdom besides. So he rode away, and when he came in front of the castle and saw the fine golden road he thought it would be a shame to ride thereon, and so he turned to the left hand and rode up out of the road. But as he came up to the door, the guards told him he was not the right person, and he must ride back again. Soon afterward the second prince also set out, and he, likewise, when he came to the golden road and his horse set its forefeet upon it, thought it would be a pity to travel upon it, so he turned aside to the right hand and went up. When he came to the gate, the guards refused him admittance, and told him he was not the person expected, and so he had to return homeward. The youngest prince, who had all this time been wandering about in the forest, had also remembered that the year was up, and soon after his brother's departure he appeared before the castle and rode up straight on the golden road, for he was so deeply engaged in thinking of his beloved princess that he did not observe it. As soon as he arrived at the door it was opened, and the princess received him with joy, saving he was her deliverer and the lord of her dominions. Soon after their wedding was celebrated, and when it was over the princess told her husband that his father had forgiven him and desired to see him. Thereupon he rode to the old king's palace, and told him how his brothers had betrayed him while he slept, and had sworn him to silence. When the king heard this he would have punished the false brothers, but they had prudently taken themselves off in a ship, and they never returned home afterward.
Then the prince begged for their release, till at last the dwarf brought them out. But he warned the youngest to beware of them, for they had evil in their hearts. When his brothers came he was very glad, and he related to them all that had happened to him, how he had found the water of life and brought away a cupful of it, and how he had rescued a beautiful princess, who for a whole year was going to wait for him, and then he was to return to be married to her, and receive a rich kingdom. After this tale the three brothers rode away together, and soon entered a province where there were war and famine raging, and the king thought he should perish, so great was his necessity. The youngest prince went to this king and gave him the bread, with which he fed and satisfied his whole people. And then the prince gave him the sword, wherewith he defeated and slew all his enemies, and regained peace and quiet. This effected, the prince took back the bread and sword, and rode on farther with his brothers, and by they came to two other provinces where also war and famine were destroying the people. To each king the prince lent his bread and sword, and so saved 3 kingdoms. After this they went on board a ship to pass over the sea which separated them from home, and during the voyage the 2 elder brothers said to one another, "Our brother has found the water of life and we have not, therefore our father will give the kingdom which belongs to us to him, and our fortune will be taken away." Indulging these thoughts they became so envious that they consulted together how they should kill him, and one day, waiting till he was fast asleep, they poured the water out of his cup and took it for themselves, while they filled his up with bitter salt water. As soon as they arrived at home the youngest brother took his cup to the sick king, that he might drink out of it and regain his health. But scarcely had he drunk a very little of the water when he became worse than before, for it was as bitter as wormwood. While the king lay in this state, the 2 elder princes came, and accused their brother of poisoning their father. But they had brought the right water, and they handed it to the king. Scarcely had he drunk a little out of the cup when the king felt his sickness leave him, and soon he was as strong and healthy as in his young days. The 2 brothers now went to the youngest prince, mocking him and saying, "You certainly found the water of life, but you had the trouble and we had the reward. You should have been more cautious and kept your eyes open, for we took your cup while you were asleep on the sea, and, moreover, in a year one of us intends to fetch your princess. Beware, however, that you betray us not. The king will not believe you, and if you say a single word your life will be lost, but if you remain silent you are safe." The old king, nevertheless, was very angry with his youngest son, who had conspired, as he believed, against his life. He caused his court to be assembled, and sentence was given to the effect that the prince should be secretly shot. And once as he rode out hunting, unsuspicious of any evil, the huntsman was sent with him to perform the deed. By and by, when they were alone in the wood, the huntsman seemed so sad that the prince asked him what ailed him. The huntsman replied, "I cannot and yet must tell you." "Tell me boldly what it is," said the prince. "I will forgive you." "Ah, it is no other than that I must shoot you, for so has the king ordered me," said the huntsman with a deep sigh. The prince was frightened and said, "Let me live, dear huntsman, let me live. I will give you my royal coat, and you shall give me yours in exchange." To this the huntsman readily assented, for he felt unable to shoot the prince, and after they had exchanged their clothing the huntsman returned home, and the prince went deeper into the wood. A short time afterward 3 wagons laden with gold and precious stones came to the king's palace for his youngest son. They were sent by the 3 kings in token of gratitude for the sword which had defeated their enemies, and the bread which had nourished their people. At this arrival the old king said to himself, "Perhaps, after all, my son was guiltless," and he lamented to his courtiers that he had let his son be killed. But the huntsman cried out, "He lives yet, for I could not find it in my heart to fulfill your commands," and he told the king how it had happened. The king felt as if a stone had been removed from his heart, and he caused it to be proclaimed everywhere throughout his dominions that his son might return and would again be taken into favor. Meanwhile the princess had caused a road to be made up to her castle of pure shining gold, and she told her attendants that whoever should ride straight up this road would be the right person, and one whom they might admit into the castle. But, on the contrary, whoever should ride up not on the road, but by the side, they were ordered on no account to admit, for he was not the right person. When, therefore, the time came round which the princess had mentioned to the youngest prince, the eldest brother thought he would hasten to her castle and announce himself as her deliverer, that he might gain her as a bride and the kingdom besides. So he rode away, and when he came in front of the castle and saw the fine golden road, he thought it would be a shame to ride thereon, and so he turned to the left hand and rode up out of the road. But as he came up to the door the guards told him he was not the right person, and he must ride back again. Soon afterward the second prince also set out, and he, likewise, when he came to the golden road and his horse set its 4 feet upon it, thought it would be a pity to travel upon it, so he turned aside to the right hand and went up. When he came to the gate the guards refused him admittance, and told him he was not the person expected, and so he had to return homeward. The youngest prince, who had all this time been wandering about in the forest, had also remembered that the year was up, and soon after his brother's departure he appeared before the castle and rode up straight on the golden road, for he was so deeply engaged in thinking of his beloved princess that he did not observe it. As soon as he arrived at the door it was opened, and the princess received him with joy, saving he was her deliverer and the lord of her dominions. Soon after their wedding was celebrated, and when it was over the princess told her husband that his father had forgiven him and desired to see him. Thereupon he rode to the old king's palace, and told him how his brothers had betrayed him while he slept, and had sworn him to silence. When the king heard this, he would have punished the false brothers, but they had prudently taken themselves off in a ship, and they never returned home afterward.